Mr. Webb.
Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. President.
Morning.
Mr. President, I believe let me kind of bring us back to where we left off yesterday, just to reacclimate ourselves. I was asking you a series of questions yesterday, Mr. President, concerning trying to determine exactly what it is you knew and approved of as far as the conduct and activities of Oliver North, John Poindexter, and the National Security Council as far as their involvement in assisting the Contras militarily after the Boland Amendment passed. And I'm going to continue on with questions in that vein for a few moments, Mr. President. Let me start with, first of all, I believe we were talking about Oliver North yesterday for a while, and if I remember your testimony correctly, you indicated that you do have an understanding or a recollection that Oliver North, after the Boland Amendment passed in October of 1984, that he did have some contact with Contra leaders. Is that correct?
I think it is, yes. There wasn't, as I say, I had assured everybody that we would have to abide by the law, right, but I didn't think there was anything in the law that prevented us from remaining in contact with the people that we've been trying to help and working with.
I understand. But is it fair to say, Mr. President, is it true that even though you had an understanding that he had some contact with the Contras, after Boland passed, at no time did you know or have any indication whatsoever that Oliver L. North was participating in planning and directing and advising the Contras in connection with military and paramilitary activities, including giving logistical support? You had no idea he was doing that, did you, sir?
No, I guess that I had never, had any inkling that that we were guiding their strategy in any way.
And that's something.
If he did that, which
that's
is
correct.
Another question.
Yes.
If he did that, you never knew about it.
No.
Okay. And although, is it true, Mr. President, that at that time, after Boland passed, you actually had heard press stories that actually reported in the newspapers that that's exactly what Oliver North was doing, and you looked into it, and you were told that it was false and incorrect, and that North wasn't doing those things. Is that correct?
I have to say I don't recall that at all.
Right. Let me ask you this, Mr. President. Do you remember answering some interrogatories in connection with the investigation by the grand jury and the Office of Independent Counsel?
Yes.
And I'm going to show those to you at this time because I suspect as the morning proceeds, Mr. President, it may be helpful to you to look at those interrogatories if I need to show them to you. Let me hand you a copy of it right now.
Your Honor, at this stage in the game, I would renew the defense request for the answers to the interrogatory.
I'll give them to him.
You are now.
Yes.
Now you have resisted all along turning those over to the defense on the ground that was neither Brady material nor Jenks material. And now, what has it become in the last 5 minutes?
Well, I don't want to give them to him, but because I'm going to use them with the witness, I believe he must have when I use a document with the witness to refresh his recollection or to establish a fact, I've always been of the belief, I assume he has a right to ask for them at this point, and my understanding of the rules of evidence is I have to tender them to him. That's the only reason. It would
have been nice if you would have given them ahead of time so he could study it, so that if he wants to ask follow-up questions, he's really not going to be capable of doing that based on a 3-inch thick stack of documents, which he sees for the first time during the cross-examination of President Reagan.
Well, let me address that. Actually, so Your Honor understands, I was going to tender a copy to Your Honor, so Your Honor understands what's here. When the President answered the interrogatories, the first pages, which are about a ½ an inch, are the answers to the interrogatories. Attached are a number of exhibits, which are referenced occasionally in the interrogatories, all of which, it is my understanding, the defense has, Your Honor, and it's had for some time. I'm only going to allude to certain interrogatories that I think are necessary to refresh the President's recollection, but I believed I should tender them at this time to the defense. And
well, number one, there's nothing I can do about it now. And number two, you have whatever you have, and you can do whatever you want with it. And if you feel later on that you feel that something was done that should be rectified, you can always file a motion to that effect. I'm not going to interrupt the cross-examination of this witness on that basis. But I would have preferred, Mr. Webb, that if you were planning to do that you turn this stuff over to the defense in advance to give them a chance to prepare for it.
Well, I would, Your Honor.
Not just this on this matter, but in general. I don't want people to do things that take the other side by surprise.
And I agree with that philosophy. I do not think these interrogatories, Your Honor, well, I don't want to argue.
Let's proceed.
Your Honor, let me just respond just briefly to one statement Mr. Webb made. The fact that we may have received isolated documents within this group is of no relevance at all. We had no idea that any of these documents would have been related to a particular interrogatory question, since we did not know what the questions and the answers were, and I just want to clarify the record with regard to that. And also state for the record that these interrogatory answers, of course, are and questions we've been seeking for several months from the prosecution.
Nothing that I have said here is designed to indicate that as a matter of law you were entitled to these earlier, because if there are no Brady material in there and no Jenks material, you obviously are not entitled to them. But as a matter of general fairness, it seems to me that if they're going to be used in questioning the witness, the defense should have an opportunity to know what's going on, and they can hardly know what's going on if they have never seen this. Let's proceed.
Awesome. Mr.
Your Honor,
President, I will show you.
This is the first time I've ever seen a packet of that size. I was given what I was told were the interrogatories and my answers to them, and that was a packet about finger thick.
Maybe I'll explain this to you, Mr. President. I believe what your lawyer probably showed you are the actual answers to the interrogatories, which are tabbed for your benefit with numbers on them, showing the answers to the interrogatories.
Yes.
And so that as I ask you questions, I'm going to be referring you to these answers to the interrogatories, which are the first part of the packet that I'm tendering to you at this point.
But I read all of those and the answers and agreed that those were my answers that I had given.
I understand. And as I understand your testimony yesterday, Mr. President, you indicated that...
You better come to the bench. I'm still bothered by all of this, and I want to find out more about it. Be allowed to ask you some questions based on those interrogatories, but I expect it will not be a great number.
Your Honor, would you like a copy of the interrogatories? Would you like a copy of the interrogatories?
Yes. Can we put this
Just
thing back?
for the record, Mr. President, I'm going to again explain that the first part, which I have tabs on, are the interrogatories, and occasionally as I ask you questions, if there's something that I might need to refresh your recollection on, I'll call your attention to an interrogatory and I'll give you an opportunity to review it, and then you can tell me whether that's in your interrogatory answer. And so that's the purpose for which I'm tendering the interrogatories to you. What started this inquiry, if I may go back, is that I was asking you a question as to whether or not you remembered that in connection with Oliver North's activities in providing assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua, I asked you a question as to whether you remembered in one of your interrogatories stating that in fact, and I'm going to show you the interrogatory, I'm referring to interrogatory number 10 at this point in time, to show you an example, Mr. President. In interrogatory number 10, you were asked a question about whether you ever learned that Oliver North participated in planning, directing, or advising Contra military or paramilitary operations or logistical support for such operations. And as you gave your answer, you went on to explain that prior to me talking to you about the diversion, you did not know that Lieutenant Colonel North participated in planning, directing, or advising. NFF stands for the Contras, is that correct?
Well, let me say...
I'm going to object to the way in which Mr. Webb has asked that question. If we're going to get into this question...
I'll strike the question. I'll strike it.
Thank you.
In the Mr. President, it says in the interrogatories where you say advising NFF military or paramilitary operations or logistical support for such operations, the question I'm asking is the next line. Although I heard about allegations in the press that Lieutenant Colonel North was engaged in such activities, I understood that these allegations were incorrect.
Due to technical difficulties, we will be unable to continue with the video portion of former President Reagan's testimony for about the next 10 minutes. We will, however, continue the proceedings now with his audio testimony.
The only purpose for me showing you the interrogatories, Mr. President, was simply to ask you, in fact, in your interrogatory answer, do you see that you made that statement?
Well, here is the answer. The thing that I'm curious about was, yes, I was given this packet and of my answers. And it's impossible for me to remember what I said then and all of the points of that. But I did deliver back the interrogatories and my answers with a statement that now, having been able to read them as to what I said, that yes, I stood by these answers to the interrogatories.
Okay.
But at this moment now, I don't feel up to someone asking me and my being able to remember what I read in that brief time that I had the interrogatory. But I could recognize when I came upon the answer that yes, that was my position.
That's fine. That's my only question is that in your interrogatory answer, you do state there that you had heard allegations in the press that North was engaged in such activities, and you understood that the allegations were incorrect. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. My question to you is this, Mr. President. Can you tell me who you talked to? Who told you that the allegations in the press about North being involved in assisting the Contras was false or incorrect?
Well, here again, to try and remember such a thing in the position that I was in and with all that was going on, no, there are any number of people who could have provided that answer. It could have been Bill Casey, the late Bill Casey from CIA. It could have been Admiral Poindexter. It could have been some people from the Defense Department, or all of the people that were involved in some way or to some extent with what was going on and our trying to get the Congress to support us in that activity. But right now, for me to put my finger on who told me something, no.
Okay, but in light of that answer, I take it, is it a fair statement, Mr. President, that you were not aware at any time after Boland passed that Oliver North created and supervised an overseas Contra supply operation called Project Democracy with assets of several $1 million? You were not aware of that?
Objection, Your Honor. Grounds for my objection as follows. We are talking about, as I understand it, using question number 10 in the interrogatory and the answer to number 10 in the interrogatory as a vehicle for impeaching the President of the United States somewhat. The answer basically says, and I read, I knew that Lieutenant Colonel North's responsibilities include work related to Central America and specifically Nicaragua, and then goes on to answer. And to use this answer in question, or part of it, for purposes of, first it was being used supposedly to refresh the witness's recollection. Then it was being used, now it seems to be used to impeach his prior testimony. And there's no inconsistency here.
I'm not even asking to impeach. I moved on to another question.
It's also assuming facts that are not in evidence, Your Honor.
Just a minute. Let's not get upset, and let's not make a federal case out of this.
I'm for that.
That is, what you're asking him now vastly expands on answer number 10, and I won't allow it.
Fine. In light of the answer, Mr. President, while you as I understand it, never, after Boland passed, ever learned of North's directing and participating in Contra activities, you sensed that time. Now, as you sit here now in this courtroom today, in this videotape proceeding, you do know today that, in fact, North did heavily engage and participate in Contra supply efforts. Is that correct?
Well, I'm going to stand by the answers that I gave in this, which were made much closer to the time and period, and to try and recall something of that kind. I know that he was very active, and that was certainly with my approval, because I yesterday made plain how seriously I felt about the Contra situation and what it meant to all of us here in the Americas. And so obviously there were many things that were being done, but again, as I say, I was convinced that they were all being done within the law.
Well, let me make sure I understand your last answer, Mr. President, because I thought you told us a moment ago that at least at the time, back in 1985 and 1986, that you did not know of and had not learned of North's activities in assisting and directing the Contra supply efforts. Is that correct?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Overruled.
Well, I think it is all here, and I was under the impression that if I found anything wrong with one of these answers, I would state that it was incorrect, and I returned this document with my answers and with my statement that I stood by these answers.
I understand. And that's all I'm asking you is based on what you said there and based on your own knowledge. You, as I understand your testimony, am I correct? At the time, back in 1985 and 1986, after Boland passed, you were not aware and did not learn of North's activities in supplying the Contras with military aid. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure I'm understanding this. My major was in economics, not law. And
President, I'm asking you what I believe you just told me a moment ago, which is that you did not learn of that back in 1985 and 1986 when it was going on. Did you not just tell me that a few moments ago?
Well, what I'm saying is that I could answer, and even then in a general way, as to what his task was and what he was doing, but I wasn't following it day by day so that I could pin down and say, this is what he is doing today, and this. I can't, I just don't have that kind of a memory.
But do you stick by the answer then in your interrogatory that you did not know and did not learn of that activity? That's my question to you here.
Sustained.
Well, what activity?
That's all right. You don't have to answer.
The objection's been sustained.
All right.
And my question then is, at least today, Mr. President, today, as we sit here now in the courtroom, you have come to learn, and you do know today, that in fact Oliver North did engage in that type of Contra resupply activities. Is that correct?
Well, it was correct only to the extent that, I repeat, that anything that we could do to be of help, but it had to be within the confines of the law, of the Boland Amendment. And to this day, I assume that that's what he was doing. But I didn't follow and every day get a detailed report on who he had spoken to or what he had said, because I didn't think it was necessary.
Well, is it your testimony now that you did know at the time that North was involved in some type of Contra-related activities, supplying the Contras?
He didn't say that.
Objection, Your Honor.
He didn't say that. Try something else.
I will, Your Honor. Mr. President, did you ever authorize Oliver North or the National Security Council to use Richard Secord or Albert Hakim to assist in providing financial and military support for the Contras?
No, I had heard reports about them and in connection with some of the private groups that were trying to reach the Contras with aid and so forth. I knew very little about either one of them, but I'd heard their names connected with such things.
Okay. Well, let me question. So did you, what's the answer to my question? Back in 1985 and 1986, did you authorize North or the NSC to use Secord and Hakim to provide financial and military support for the Contras?
I don't think it was ever brought to my attention for such a decision.
And so you did not authorize it?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Now, Mr. President, after Boland passed, did you ever authorize North or anyone at the National Security Council to have meetings with private United States citizens for the purpose of asking for financial contributions to militarily assist the Contras?
Yesterday I answered that, and I would repeat the answer to that. I said that these citizen groups very likely would not know how, once they had offered to help and had, for example, raised funds to be of help, would not know how to contact or who to contact in the country, and that this, I thought, was well within the law, that our people could tell them how they should go about this and who would be the persons they would need to contact.
So did you authorize them to go out and actually seek contributions? That's my question.
Objection.
I didn't get an answer to that question.
Overruled.
I didn't know. I never told us about anything of going out and encouraging people to do this.
Thank you. Now, In connection with another aspect of the Contra NSC relationship during the time that you were president in 1985 and 1986, do you recall an incident occurring involving a pilot named Gene Hasenfus that was shot down over Nicaragua carrying arms to the Contras?
I have a memory of a plane that was shot down and that one of the people who turned out unhurt, but all right, was an American citizen. And I had no knowledge of that he was involved in any way, nor do I recall his indicating that he was of having anything to do with the government and our program. But there he was, and apparently a prisoner.
Okay, and my question to you is, do you recall who the first person was in government who told you that Gene Hasenfus, who was shot down over Nicaragua, had no connection to the United States government or the National Security Council? Do you know who told you that?
I do not recall who told me that, but that was the information that I had.
Okay.
On the other hand, I still felt that he was an American citizen and we had a certain responsibility to him.
And my question is, was John Poindexter the first person who told you about the Hasenfus crash, and did he tell you that Hasenfus had absolutely no involvement or connection with the United States government?
Well, as I've just said, with all the people dealing with these things, this is possibly true, but I cannot recall who gave me directly the information.
Okay, if you would look at the interrogatory marked 45 to 47, to help refresh your recollection of what you said under oath previously, Mr. President, let me help you if I can for a minute. Directing your attention to interrogatory 45 to 47, I think you will see an interrogatory answer relating to Hasenfus, which I will let you look at for a moment so you can see it there.
Yes, it does say it. It was Admiral John Poindexter. And but here again, at this time, and with all of this, it's a long time ago, and this, as I say, having read this, I did the whole thing, each question. I did say that, okay, I had to stand behind these statements. Now, if you'd asked me to take a look at this, then I would have remembered.
And that's, Mr. President, I want you to be assured I'm not being critical of your inability to remember the interrogatories. I'm simply asking you these questions, and I will always show them to you because I don't expect you to remember everything that's in here. For example, let's just take this one, for example. As I understand your statement under oath in the interrogatory, which I believe you accept as a truthful statement, Admiral Poindexter assured you that the Hasenfus operation had no connection to the United States government whatsoever. Is that what you state there?
Yes, and I opened that statement with saying, to the best of my knowledge, I first learned of the Hasenfus crash from Admiral Poindexter.
I understand. And you gave a date there that you believe you learned it on October 7th, 1986. Is that correct?
Well, let me find that. October 7th, 86, yes.
And you go on to say under oath in your interrogatory that when Poindexter told you that Hasenfus had no connection to the United States government whatsoever, you go on to say, when I asked whether General John Singlob might be involved in this operation as had been reported in the press, I was told no by Admiral Poindexter. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in fact, you go on to state there, and maybe I won't have to refresh your memory by showing you the press statement. Following this, you went out on the south lawn of the White House en route to North Carolina, and you were asked by a reporter, and at that time you stated emphatically there was no United States involvement in that operation. Do you see that at the bottom of the interrogatory there, Mr. President?
Let me catch up with you.
Oh, you may.
Your Honor, just an objection is this being well beyond the scope of direct and really irrelevant to the issues.
Well, it's not irrelevant to the issues, and I don't think it's really beyond the scope of the direct either. I overrule the objection.
Yes, I'm reading this here.
And my question to you, sir, is, I believe you told us yesterday that John Poindexter, as your national security advisor, is the person that you relied upon and depended upon to provide you with accurate information regarding national security matters such as this. Is that correct?
That's why he was called my national security advisor.
Okay. And my question to you is that have you learned since that time that Gene Hasenfus, in fact, was part of North's Project Democracy operation that he was running out of the White House to assist the Contras. Have you since learned that?
No.
Well,
I don't, and I don't think I saw a reminder of that in the interrogatory.
I'm talking about not what's in the interrogatory. I'm talking about as you sit here today, Mr. President, I'm trying to determine whether, as you sit here today, whether you recognize as to whether John Poindexter gave you correct and accurate information at that time. I'm asking you today, as you sit here in this courtroom, have you now learned, since there's been the Tower Commission report that reported back to you, and the trials that have occurred, as far as what you know today, are you now aware of the evidence that shows Hasenfus was flying a plane for North?
Your Honor, objection. The allegation in this indictment is a conspiracy which went from the 84 until the end of 86. Extensive questioning.
Well, that is not a valid objection, but President Reagan has already said that he doesn't know about that, and so you're just repeating the same question. Have you learned that he was connected with Oliver North?
No, my memory goes no further than the fact
that takes care of it.
He was a citizen of our country and was the victim of an accident.
Now, Mr. President, I'm going to refer you now to certain documents and letters, some of which you were shown yesterday, that relate to some of the charges in this indictment. And in order to do that, I'm going to give you a book of some documents which are tabs so that it'll make it easier and things will go more quickly here today for us.
All right.
And I'm going to show you, I'll give one to the defense at this time, to the court. These are simply some documents, Mr. President, that I may allude to as I ask you questions, Your Honor, concerning certain events. And for your convenience, as I ask you a question, if I call your attention to a tab number, you'll be able to find the tab number here, Mr. President.
All right.
Let me start with, I want to go back to the year 1985, to what I think was the first time that Congress started to look into activities of your National Security Council in militarily assisting the Contras. Would you look at tab 11, Mr. President? Mr. President, as you can see, that's a letter to Robert Mcfarlane, your National Security Advisor, dated August 16th, 1985. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to direct your attention simply to very specific portions of the letter, just so you understand, I think, so you'll understand what the letter's about. Do you see the first sentence, the first paragraph, where Mr. Barnes from the subcommittee, from the Committee on Foreign Affairs, says to Mr. Mcfarlane, I am writing in response to recent press reports detailing the activities of certain National Security Council staff members in providing advice and fundraising support to the Nicaraguan rebel leaders. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you go down a few more paragraphs, down to the second to last paragraph on the first page, just so I want you to understand what they're inquiring about of your administration, you'll see in the next to last paragraph in the second sentence where it says reports, quote, administration officials describing Marine Lieutenant Colonel North as providing tactical influence on rebel military operations, facilitating contacts for prospective financial donors, and otherwise organizing and coordinating rebel efforts. These activities clearly have the effect of supporting the Nicaraguan rebels. Do you see that there?
I see that.
Okay. Now, the reason I call that letter to your attention is that I want you to look at the next document, Exhibit 12, which is Mr. Mcfarlane's response to Chairman Barnes. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes.
Now, I would like you, if you could, for a moment, to examine that letter. And I think I can help you if I call your attention to certain specific paragraphs that I'm interested in, although you're certainly free to read the entire letter. I think you'll see from the first paragraph that Mr. Mcfarlane is telling Mr. Barnes in this letter of September 12, 1985, that this is in reply to your letter of August 16th regarding the activities of members of the National Security Staff in connection with the Nicaraguan democratic resistance. Like you, I take these charges very seriously and consequently have thoroughly examined the facts and circumstances which would bear upon those charges in these charges in any fashion. Do you see that that's in response to the inquiry?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to direct your attention down to, if you would, look over on the next page, page 2 of that letter, as Mr. Mcfarlane is responding to Barnes. If you look at the last sentence of the first partial paragraph, first paragraph on the page, the sentence that starts with, "None of us has solicited funds, facilitated contacts for prospective potential donors, or otherwise organized or coordinated the military or paramilitary efforts of the resistance." Do you see that?
I see it.
Okay. Now, would you then go to the last page, the next page, page 3 of the letter, where Mr. Mcfarlane concludes by saying, "Mr. Chairman, like you, I am most concerned that at a time when humanitarian assistance is being extended to the UNO, there be no misgivings as to the existence of any parallel efforts to provide directly or indirectly support for military or paramilitary activities in Nicaragua. There has not been, nor will there be, any such activities by the National Security Staff." Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, my questions are going to go to, first of all, this letter itself and the statements that are set forth therein. Did you ever approve or authorize the response that's set forth there in tab 12 by Mr. Mcfarlane?
I don't believe that I have no recollection of seeing this, but I understand exactly what he is saying here, and I think it is in agreement with all the things that I have said we insisted upon.
Okay, well, let me go back to my question and I'll move on. My first question is, did you approve or authorize that response?
I don't recall ever having seen this, but then again, as I say, it's just a plain case of I don't recall having seen this or having authorized it.
And when you answered your interrogatories, do you recall at that time, if you look at interrogatory 21, well, let me ask you this, I don't even have, do you recall in your interrogatories that when asked that question, you indicated that you had not authorized or approved that letter?
I cannot recall every word that I read. I read through those interrogatories once, and I...
Let me try to help you, Mr. President. Let me turn to interrogatory 21.
Specifically, the answer is I do not recall approving or authorizing Mr. Mcfarlane's responses.
That's correct. That's well. And as I understand what you just told me, as you look at that letter now, you're in agreement with what is set forth in that letter? Is that what I understand you to say?
Well, seeing this here, yes, I believe that this is a pretty clear effort by the man who was in charge to make plain what the situation was.
Okay, and my question to you, Mr. President, is that the statements that I just called to your attention concerning Mr. Mcfarlane telling Congress on this date, on September 12, 1985, when he told Congress that the National Security Council had not been involved in any fundraising activities on behalf of the Contras and had not provided any support, directly or indirectly, for military or paramilitary activities in Nicaragua. As to those statements, is it your testimony today, as you sit here in this courtroom today, that you believe those to be truthful statements?
That are made here?
Yes, that are made in that letter.
I have no reason to doubt them, except that also I have to say, again, I have no recollection of ever seeing this letter before.
Okay, but just so we're clear, I'm talking to you today, Mr.
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Judge, I think this goes to an issue that the President testified to yesterday about some subsequent letters that Mr. Poindexter sent, which he said that he agreed with, and I think I have the right to at least try to show. Mr. President, as far as you sitting here today in this courtroom, in this videotape, those statements that North and the NSC did not participate in military and paramilitary assistance to the Contras and raise money, the Tower Commission that you appointed and you told us yesterday about advised you as the President that those were not true statements. Is that correct?
I do not recall that at all.
Let me see if I can refresh your memory, Mr. President. Let's talk about the Tower Commission just for a moment. The Tower Commission was a commission that you appointed.
That's right.
In November of 1986, after Ed Meese told you about a memo that indicated there might have been a diversion of funds. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you had a press conference, I believe, on December 1, 1986, where you announced to the nation that you wanted to appoint a commission that would fully investigate these facts, would report back to you as the President and get to the bottom of this matter. Do you remember that?
I remember that, yes. I thought the very fact of appointing a commission to find out what happened was evidence that I did not know what had happened or whether there had been a diversion or any money to divert. And I have to say that after the Tower Commission reported to me, I still do not have the answers to those questions. They were unable to provide them.
Well, let's talk about that for a few moments, Mr. President. I'm asking you, first of all, am I correct that you wanted the Tower Commission to report back to you with a full airing of the facts as they found them? Is that correct?
Yes.
And you appointed men to that commission that you had a lot of confidence in their integrity and their ability. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they did report back to you in a report that's been known as the Tower Commission Report. Is that correct?
Yes.
I would like you, and now I'm going to focus on, do you recall the Tower Commission, your actual commission, after they reported back to you in March of 1987, they told you that they had found evidence that in fact North and the NSC had become heavily involved in rendering military and paramilitary assistance to the Contras. Do you recall that?
Objection.
I don't recall that.
The Tower Commission's enunciated purpose, as articulated by the President of the United States, was not to attribute guilt or innocence to anybody, to try to reach any conclusions about legality or illegality. It was merely a fact-finding effort by the President of the United States to get his arms around what the situation is. Counsel is now trying to bootstrap in some way that Tower Commission report into this proceeding, I guess by use of the interrogatory question and answers. And I think it is prejudicial to the defense, and I think it's a line of questioning that's irrelevant. I would respectfully ask the question.
Someone else wants to talk.
I would add, I think I agree with what Mr. Becker said, and this line of questioning and some of the similar questions that Mr. Webb has asked has attempted to elicit from this witness fact-finding with respect to underlying facts of this whole controversy, which could only have come to him in the form of hearsay and statements from other persons. I had not understood that this was the purpose of this process, and it seems to me it's beyond the scope of the order that you issued with respect to the President's testimony.
Your Honor, this goes to one very specific answer the President gave on Mr. Beckler's direct examination yesterday that is critical and to the heart of this case. The President was shown the letters that are alleged in the indictment that were sent by John Poindexter to Congress in July of 1986, which had in them, which the government has contended in the indictment, are false statements about these very things. The President looked at those letters yesterday on the witness stand, which will be played to this jury, and told the jury that in those letters, he's read them over today on the witness stand, and he turned to Mr. Beckler and he said, I agree with everything said in these letters, except I would have added in some profanity. That was his answer. That answer, I respectfully suggest, is an answer that I have a right to probe on cross-examination, because it is my belief that if I'm allowed to do so, I can show the President where, based on what is said in those letters and then what Mr. Poindexter, when he adopted those letters, to suggest that today, or to suggest to the jury that today the President would authorize or approve those letters with false statements, is something I think he doesn't mean. And I intend to get to that point, and that's where I'm going. And I believe that I'm limiting my questions precisely to that point. It's within the scope of the direct examination, and it goes to a very critical point in the case. I don't intend to belabor this, but I'd like to make my point.
May I respond, Your Honor?
I'm not going to go on and on that. Just to say, I don't believe that in general the government has a right to find out and examine this witness as to what he believes today, what the facts are, because the facts are the facts, and you can bring out the facts at the trial in some other way. However, on this particular question, the defense having opened the door to that very issue, the government is entitled to explore it further a little bit. I overrule the objections.
Mr. President, when your Tower Commission reported back to you in March of 1987, did the Tower Commission not tell you, Mr. President, Oliver North and your National Security Council were involved in 1985 and 1986 in assisting the Contras militarily and paramilitarily? Do you recall that being told to you by your Tower Commission?
I don't recall that. And I can only tell you that my interest in that commission was to find out the thing that I still do not know. And that was, how did there turn out to be more money than the $12.2 million for the tow tank missiles? Who delivered, and who, obviously, it seemed to me that someone must have raised the price for those. But that was never found out. I still do not know. And then to talk as they do about a diversion of that money that was found in that Swiss bank account, I have no information at all that there was ever any more money than was in the account when it was found, or that any diversion to anyone had been attempted of that money. And I can recall that a member of the press...
Can I interrupt the President just for a moment? Can I ask the answer to be struck after the words I don't recall? I asked nothing about the diversion. I asked whether he was told by the Tower Commission of whether North and the NSC were involved in Contra-related paramilitary activities. And everything after the word I don't recall, I respectfully suggest should be struck. And I'm going to try to move this along as quickly as I can. But that answer, I respectfully suggest, is completely unresponsive. Completely.
Well, I don't think it's unresponsive to state what I appointed the commission to do and what I tried to get from them, and they could not supply that information unto this day.
The request is denied. I'll let President Reagan answer the question in his own way.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Well,
if you're unless you're finished.
Well, in this point, as I say, this was what, as a matter of fact, one thing sticks in my memory of a member of the press asking me that if I had known about this extra money that was supposedly given for the tow missiles, what would I have done with it? And I told him, and I would still say that today, if I'd known about it, I would have given it back. All we were entitled to was the $12.2 million, and we'd gotten that.
Do I understand your answer to be that you don't recall whether the Tower Commission told you in March of 1987 that Lieutenant Colonel North and the National Security Council were involved in militarily assisting the Contras? Do you recall if they told you that? I don't recall that, because probably because I was listening for an answer that I never got. Look, well, let's see what your commission told you. Look at Exhibit 30. In that book is the Tower Commission report. Maybe you can help him. I might ask Ms. Reagan to help the President on occasion if we can find an exhibit just to make things move. Yes. If you don't object. I want to call your attention, Mr. President, to what's known as it's actually page number 3, Roman numeral 3-23. And I'm going to show you exactly what portion of your Tower Commission's report back to you. Ask you if you remember now that they told you, what I'm reading in the second column, where it says, as early as April of 1985, Lieutenant Colonel North maintained detailed records of expenditures for Contra military equipment, supplies, and operations. On April 11, 1985, Lieutenant Colonel North sent a memorandum to Mr. Mcfarlane describing 2 sea lifts and 2 air lifts as of April 9, 1985. This memorandum The memorandum set out the kind of munition purchased, the quantity, and in some instances the cost. Lieutenant Colonel North also noted from July 1984 to April 9, 1985, $17,145,594 has been expended for arms, munitions, combat operations, and support activities. And the next paragraph in particular, Mr. President, evidence suggests that at least by November of 1985, Lieutenant Colonel North had assumed a direct operational role, coordinating logistical arrangements to ship privately purchased arms to Contras. In a note to Poindexter on November 22, 1985, he described a prospective delivery of our first direct flight of ammo to the resistance field in Nicaragua. Now, the reason, and if you want to go on, it goes on to describe, Mr. President, my point is this, as you've had a chance to look at that. As far as the statement you just made a moment ago, that as you read over Mr. Mcfarlane's letter in 1985, in which he stated to Congress that the NSC was not involved at all.
Your Honor, I must object. Mr. Mcfarlane's letter ought to be at least phrased carefully by Mr. Webb if he's going to refer the President to that letter. Now let's go back to the letter and get the exact language rather than speculating on what it says.
I will do that. Mr. President, I will have Ms. Reagan direct you back to letter number, Exhibit 12, the letter you just were talking about, where you said you thought it was perfectly appropriate and you agreed with it. The letter to Chairman Barnes, dated September 12, 1985.
Yes.
I will just read the particular sentence you're talking about.
I'm reading over on the last page, page 3, Mr. President, where it says, Mr. Chairman, like you, I am most concerned that at a time when humanitarian assistance is being extended to the UNO, that there be no misgivings as to the existence of any parallel efforts to provide directly or indirectly support for military or paramilitary activities in Nicaragua. There has not been, nor will there be, any such activities by the NSC staff. Now, my only question to you, Mr. President, is now that I've shown you what your Tower Commission reported back to you on, that told you that North was involved, you're not suggesting to us, are you, that today you endorse any false statement in that letter, are you?
No, but I'm noticing that the thing that seems to be being overlooked here is that when it is spelled out as to what he was supposed to be doing, that it was the helping the very thing that we've talked about before, the acquisition of things by private donations and explaining or helping them to get contact to the proper people for the delivery of those. Now, it seems to me that that's not too far away from what we have previously been talking about, of the telling our people to offer help to private citizens who have raised the money and purchased things and do not know how to get them to the people for whom they're intended.
Sir, my question is, the statement that you just read off in Mcfarlane's letter, the statement where it says the NSC has not, nor will they be, any such activities by the NSC staff, referring to directly or indirectly support for military or paramilitary activities in Nicaragua. My question to you is, as you sit here now, you're not telling us, are you, that you would support or endorse a false statement being made to Congress by Mr. Mcfarlane in September of 1985, are you?
Objection, asked and answered several times.
I sustain the objection not on that basis, but on the basis that it must be rephrased. The question is not whether the statement is false or is not false. That's what you're trying to bring out.
Okay. Mr. President, maybe my question would be this. As you've testified to here today, you are not suggesting in testifying that you in any way would...
That's correct. No, I don't think they should be given a false statement. But again, as I say, in the play on words here and the interpretation of them, it seems to me that the only specific that has been made has been that the help was in helping private fundraisers to come in contact with and provide that help to the Contras.
So as you
Let me try, Mr. President. The letter from Mr. Mcfarlane apparently indicates that no effort has been made or will be made to provide military or support for military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. The Tower Commission report appears to indicate that Colonel North did make expenditures for Contra military equipment, supplies, and so on. Do you find that the two are consistent with each other? If they're inconsistent, do you find that the second one brands the first one as a falsehood? I think that's what he's trying to find out.
Well, I have to say there's, in the wording of all of this, possibly there is it could be interpreted that other way. I had not, because I'm remembering my telling those same people to be helpful to private citizens who were trying to do something that the Congress of the United States refused to do in abandoning its responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, in connection with...
May I would it be appropriate to plan about an hour?
Yes, let's take a short recess.
Thank you.
This week, the Supreme Court hears arguments in a case involving federal regulation of the automobile industry. Tune in for an update on how this case may affect you and your state. Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. on the West Coast.
Next, we'll continue the videotape testimony of former President Ronald Reagan. His remarks were recorded in Los Angeles February 16th and 17th and were played this week in U.S. District Court in Washington. Jurors in the trial of former National Security Advisor John Poindexter saw these videotapes Wednesday and Thursday of this week. The trial is presided over by District Judge Harold Green.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. President, one more question on the Mcfarlane 1985 letters. When you mentioned a moment ago in this proceeding that as you read the letter over, it seemed to you to be okay. Now, as you sit here now, you are aware that Mr. Mcfarlane, the man who sent the letter, has pled guilty in open court to withholding information in connection with those letters, are you not?
Objection, Your Honor.
Well,
You have some basis for that?
Yes, Your Honor. All of these, first of all, the references in that Tower Commission report.
No, we're not talking about the Tower Commission report now. He's talking about...
But this all goes back to Mr. McFarlane's supposedly, the falsehoods in Mr. McFarlane's letter. The references in the Tower Commission say evidence suggests at least by November 1985. This letter by Mr. McFarlane was in September of 1985. The timing is out of sequence, and I think it's collateral, and there's also no foundation to support the questions that Mr. Webb is now asking of this witness. There seems to be an attempt to put in his entire case through one witness. It's gone well beyond the direct examination.
I overrule the objection.
Mr. President, in connection with your statement or testimony that as you looked at McFarlane's letter to Congressman Barnes, as you looked at it this morning and said that it looked okay to you, did you consider and do you remember that Mr. McFarlane, the man who sent the letter, has pled guilty in open court to withholding information from Congress in connection with that letter?
no, I was not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. President, in connection with this interest that Congress had in the activities of your National Security Council after Boland passed, if you would look at exhibit number 15, I think Mr. Beckler showed that to you yesterday. That's a letter with an attached resolution of inquiry from Congress, again going back to this same issue of Congress wanting to inquire into whether North and the NSC were actively involved in militarily assisting the Contras. Do you see that letter in the resolution attached, sir?
Yes, I see the letter.
You see the resolution attached to it? My only question to you, Mr. President, if you've had a chance to review it, is simply that, does that, at least you can see that Congress has introduced a House resolution called 485 to try to inquire into whether or not Oliver North or any other members of the National Security Council were involved in supporting the Nicaraguan resistance. At least that you can see what they're inquiring into. Is that correct?
Yes, this was done in June of '86, this resolution.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's what I want to call to your attention. By the way, I take it that, well, let me direct your attention to what is marked, I believe, as Exhibit 16, which are letters that come from John Poindexter on July 21, 1986, to 3 different congressional committees that respond to that House inquiry. I believe you were shown one or more of these letters yesterday in your examination by Mr. Beckler, if you remember.
Yes.
Now, my question is, am I correct, sir, based on what you told us yesterday, that you had never seen those letters before they were sent, nor did you authorize or approve John Poindexter to send those specific letters? Is that correct?
No, I don't recall any of that or of seeing them then. I have no quarrel with this letter that I've just read.
I understand. You did not see them and authorize them in advance?
No.
Okay. Now, do you see in that letter where Mr. Poindexter, if you look at the first letters to Chairman Fussell?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see that in connection with that letter to the chairman, where Mr. Poindexter, your National Security Advisor, says to the chairman, last fall, in an effort to cooperate with Chairman Barnes, my predecessor, Robert C. Mcfarlane met with members of your committee and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. While I did not participate in those discussions, I understand that information on the specific issues raised in House Resolution 485 was provided to your committee, and that this information made it clear that the actions of the National Security Council staff were in compliance with both the spirit and letter of the law regarding the support of the Nicaraguan resistance. Now, calling your attention to that, Mr. President, I understand yesterday you indicated that when you looked at this letter, you indicated, I believe you stated, that you were in agreement with this letter as you look at it today.
Yes.
Except that you might add in some profanity, I think was your comment. Do you recall that testimony yesterday?
Yes.
Okay. My question to you is, I want you to tell me, when you testified that you're in agreement with that letter, I take it, first of all, you're in agreement with the position that the letter took, that the administration strongly opposes enactment of the resolution. You were in agreement with that statement?
Opposes the enactment of the resolution, yes.
You were in agreement with that?
Yes.
But you weren't trying to suggest to the jury in any way that if this letter if this letter does contain false statements to Congress, you were not suggesting that as President of the United States you would in any way endorse or approve sending false information to Congress, were you?
No,
Thank you. Now,
I think I've made that plain, and or tried to in all of my answers here, that the restrictions that would not apply to those people and anything that they were doing, and but that we would stay within the law.
right, and you certainly, as I understand it as President, you would never have authorized or approved your National Security Advisor or any other top member of your administration to make false statements to Congress, would you?
No.
Thank you. Now, in connection with the inquiry by Congress, that House Resolution 456, are you, Mr. President, aware of whether or not, after Congress received Mr. Poindexter's response, whether Congress continued with the investigation or whether it died and was killed? Or do you know?
I don't know, no.
Okay. I take it, by the way, that as President, you would never endorse or support your administration providing false information to Congress in such a fashion that would actually obstruct or curtail a valid inquiry, would you?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Now,
So it's all getting kind of repetitious.
thank you. I'll move on, Your Honor. Let me move on to Iran, Mr. President. Leave the Contras for a moment. Let me try to go back and cover just a few factual points and then move on, Mr. President.
Move on to where?
To finish, I hope, Your Honor.
Okay.
Which I'm sure is what you want, and I do too, and I will do the very best I can to get there.
I'm not trying to
I know you're
tell
not.
you.
I know you're not. As far as the Iran initiative was concerned, Mr. President, am I correct that your best recollection is the first time that you became aware that certain elements in Iran had approached the United States to have discussions was in July of 1985 while you were in the hospital when Robert Mcfarlane came to see you? Is that correct, to the best of your recollection?
Well, that's to the best of my recollection, although I don't have really a clear memory of these events and how they were, on the days that they were transpiring.
I understand. And also, am I correct, Mr. President, that your next recollection is that you do remember that in the summer or fall of 1985, you did learn that Israel was going to ship or wanted to ship some TOW missiles to Iran in an effort to get the hostages released, and that you remember that in connection with that, at that time, that you authorized the United States to replenish those missiles when Israel sold them to Iran. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we did. Normally, we would not, because of the violation there of a policy of not furnishing arms that were being passed on to someone else. But in this particular instance, I thought the unusual circumstance in which they were going to turn the plane back at certain points and cancel the delivery if by that time their hostages had not been released.
Okay, and so you do recall at that time, in approximately the summer or fall of 1985, when you learned it, you did authorize the replenishment of the TOW missiles. Is that correct?
I can't really recall, although I do have a feeling now that at that time I found it very difficult to object to what they were proposing to do, but I really can't recall my making an answer.
Let me try to help you if I can. If you'd look at interrogatory number 23, Louise, if you'd show that to the President. And let me read off the portion that I'm trying to, this is a question about that TOW missile shipment, and I'll just read off what I understand your answer to be, where I'm starting with the, I think the second full sentence. I do recall that later in the summer or fall of 1985, I was advised that Israel sought to ship TOWs to individuals in Iran who would influence the Hezbollah to free our hostages. It was part of Israel's plan that it would abort the sale if it became apparent that the hostages would not be released. My best recollection is that at that time, in the fall of 1985, I agreed that Israel would be permitted to purchase replacement TOWs from the United States. Yeah. The only reason I'm asking you to read it, I take it that was a truthful statement, that was your best recollection at the time that you gave your interrogatories, Mr. President. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
And I thought that the freeing of those hostages who are still there in captivity and coming up 5 years of it, that it was very much in our minds. That.
Okay. And let me just, I'm going to try to go through these events as quickly as I can, but if you need me to slow down, I will do so, Mr. President. As I understand your testimony yesterday in response to Mr. Beckler's questions, you indicated that as far as a Hawk missile shipment occurring in November of 1985, you simply, today, you just can't remember knowing about that at the time it occurred. Am I correct about that?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me ask you about that Hawk missile shipment, though, because it does play a rather central role in this case, as Mr. Beckler told you yesterday. Do you remember that in or about at the time of the Hawk missile shipment, do you remember that in connection with that, your National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency did get involved and arranged for a CIA plane to get involved in flying those missiles to Iran? Did you learn that back in around November of 1985?
No, and how did we get from TOWs to Hawks?
Well, that's what I'm asking you, Mr. President. I'm talking about a Hawk missile shipment in November of 1985. And my question to you is, and if you don't know, you can tell me, in connection with a Hawk missile shipment in the fall of 1985, do you remember at all having any knowledge of the Central Intelligence Agency arranging for a CIA plane to fly those Hawks to Iran? Do you remember anything about that?
No,
okay.
I don't.
Let me see if I can help refresh you a bit on that. Do you remember actually being presented with a formal legal document that's called a presidential finding, which had to be executed by you if the CIA got involved in this type of covert activity in a foreign nation? Do you remember that at all in or about November or December of 1985?
No.
Okay. Let me try to help you if I can. Would you show the President Exhibit 17, tab 17?
No.
Mr. President, what is in tab 17 is a letter dated November 26, 1985 from William J. Casey. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if you see from the letter, he's sending to John Poindexter a document which the subject is presidential finding on the Middle East, and it simply attached to it is a draft, is a presidential finding, although not signed by you. Do you see that?
Is this the thing under the title of description?
Well, look, do you see the attachment to the letter? Let's start with that.
Is that this or this?
Mr. President, if you maybe go back to the letter. This is just so you understand, this is a letter from Casey to Poindexter, which says, pursuant to our conversation, this should go to the President for his signature and should not be passed around in hands below our level. And then do you see what is attached to the letter?
Yes.
Okay.
You were talking about his wanting not to brief the Congress of the United States.
Well, let me tell you what my interest in the document is, and I'll ask you a couple questions about it, Mr. President.
Yeah.
First of all, would it be fair to say that while you do not have any current recollection of signing the document, because it's a legal document, you don't deny that you may have signed it? Is that a fair statement? And maybe I'm not being fair. In your interrogatories, sir, do you remember making the statement in one of your interrogatories that you look at the finding, you conclude that it's not signed, you don't deny signing it because you are aware that the CIA had contemporaneous memos that indicated you signed it on December 5th, 1985. Would you like me to call your attention to your interrogatory? Look at interrogatory 27. I think it'll help the President.
Well, I'm in the same position. This initiative, while I do not deny having signed such a finding, I have no current recollection of doing so.
That's my only question. That's what you said in your interrogatory, and I take it that would be true today. Is that correct?
Yes.
And here's my question, Mr. President. I believe in fact, you actually refer in there that you've been advised that the CIA was told contemporaneously that you signed the finding on December 5th, 1985. I mean, you set that forth in your interrogatory, where it says, I have been advised that the CIA was told contemporaneously that on December 5, 1985, I signed a finding relating to this initiative.
Well, it says that my review of the unsigned finding leads me to believe that I would have understood it to relate to such an initiative.
My question to you is, at least as President of the United States, you were aware, am I correct, that under the document itself, look at the document, Louise, show him the document again, that you were aware that under the Foreign Assistance Act, that when the CIA got involved in if the CIA was involved in helping ship Hawk missiles to Iran, you recognized that this type of legal document would be presented to you for your signature. Is that correct?
Well, I would assume so.
Okay. And would it be logical to you, Mr. President, that, strike the question, I take it you did your very best as President to make sure that the CIA was also operating within legal requirements. Is that correct?
Yes.
And to the extent the law would require a presidential finding, if it were presented to you by your advisors, I take it you would sign it so that you could make the conduct legal. Is that a logical thing for you to do?
Objection. Speculation about what would or could or might happen. There's no foundation for many of this line of questioning. The witness and the objection.
Mr. President, you signed another finding, I believe you talked about it yesterday in your testimony, I believe, regarding the Iran initiative on or about January 17, 1986. Do you recall that?
I think I do, although I would like to hear just exactly what that finding was.
I will show it to you. First of all, let's show the President the finding, which I believe, what number is that, Louise?
18.
Tab 18, I believe, is the finding, I think you may have been shown this yesterday, which is a finding relating to Iran, the Iran initiative that you actually have signed, and is dated January 17th, 1986.
Yes, yeah.
Do you know today, Mr. President, as you look at Exhibit 17 and 18, which is the two findings, the one in 1985 and the one in 1986,
Yeah.
do you know today, or can you tell us, why was the finding in 1986 necessary for the Iran initiative?
Well, because of the need for covert procedures there, I think it's very evident that I ordered the Director of Central Intelligence to refrain from reporting this finding to the Congress as provided in Section 501 of the National Security Act of 47, as amended, until I otherwise direct. Well, yes, because very frankly, there was anything that went to the Congress you could expect would be made public information very soon. And making public information on these things could result in the death of a lot of people that didn't deserve that.
And my question to you is, do you know why, if you look at the finding that's in number 17, Exhibit 17, that also is a finding that relates to the Iran initiative, is it not?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know why a month later there was the need for a second finding that you signed on January 17th, which is the one on tab 18, if you'd show it to him, Louise? Why was the need for the second finding?
Actually, I can't tell you. I don't recall why there would have been.
That's fine. Now, let me ask you this. We might be able to shortcut this. Is it fair to say that as the year 1986 went on, you were generally aware that there were some shipments of weapons to Iran under the finding that you signed on January 17th, but you yourself are not aware of the underlying operational details?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And were you briefed throughout the year 1986 over time about things relating to the Iran initiative under your finding of January 17th, but you simply don't remember the specifics today?
That's right. I don't remember those specifics.
Okay. One of the things, am I correct, that you did not ever know about and were never advised of is that the Iranians were being charged a price substantially in excess of the price that the United States was receiving for the weapons. Is that correct? You were never aware of that?
No, that's the thing that I've been talking about for a long time that I'm still waiting to find out. Who raised the price on them?
Okay, well, let's go through that, if we might, for a moment. My first question is, you were not, I want to make sure it's clear, prior to November of 1986, prior to the time that Ed Meese met with you, is it correct that you were not aware of any excess profits that were generated by the sale of missiles to Iran? Is that correct?
I was only aware that we had received the $12,200,000, which was our price for those weapons.
So you were not aware of excess profits?
I was not.
Thank you. Now, and I take it would be fair to say that not only were you not aware of it, no one discussed it with you, and you never authorized it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, Ed Meese, your Attorney General, I believe met with you on November 24th, 1986, and at that time told you that he had discovered a memorandum that indicated that there had been excessive profits and that profits might have been diverted to the Contras. Do you recall that?
Yes, that was after the expose of the entire operation, the covert operation, by that paper in Beirut.
That's correct. And in fact, when you heard about that, when Mr. Meese told you about it, you were certain in your own mind that that's the first you'd ever heard about it, because you had no previous knowledge of that. Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely true.
Okay. Now, and in fact, well, let me ask you this.
Your Honor, I would just object to commentary by counsel at the end of the question.
Yeah, it's well taken.
Okay. I don't know what I said, but I was...
You do sometimes go on and sort of say, that's true, that's right.
Or okay, these types of...
I will...
Go ahead, go on.
Now, Mr. President, once Mr. Meese told you about this diversion, or that there might be a diversion, you took immediate action. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I believe, in fact, you instructed Mr. Meese to tell the public about it, and tell Congress about it, and you had a press conference, I believe, the next day on November 25th, 1986, and made some rather serious decisions regarding the staffing at the National Security Council. Is that correct?
And it was following the information that we had received about the excess money, and that this was the first knowledge that we had of that.
Okay. And at that time, you obtained the resignation of Admiral Poindexter, and I believe Oliver North was relieved of his duties at the National Security Council, and you announced that on November 25th, 1986. Is that correct?
Yes.
If you remember.
Yeah.
And at that time, I think it was a few days later, on December 1, 1986, you actually ordered the Tower Commission, or created the Tower Commission, and asked them to get to the bottom of this. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, at any time prior to November of 1986, while the Iranian initiative was going on, do you recall any conversation with your National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, in which he in any way hinted or suggested or in any way told you anything about these excess profits and the diversion to the Contras?
There was never any such conversation, because the only information we had was that there was money in excess over the $12.2 million that had been deposited in a Swiss banking account.
And I believe, am I correct, your Tower Commission, after you had it appointed, you wanted it to get to the bottom of all these facts?
Yes.
And your Tower Commission, when it reported back to you in March of 1987, the Tower Commission told you in their report that they had discovered a diversion. In fact, they told you that Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North, in being interviewed by Meese, had admitted there was a diversion. I mean, you learned that in March of 1987, didn't you?
I do not recall that. I, to this day, do not recall ever hearing that there was a diversion, that this money that was in that account, to my knowledge, could very well be just the total amount that was ever in there.
Well, let me see if I can help refresh your memory from your Tower Commission, what they told you. If you look at the Tower Commission, Louise, would you call his attention to, let me get the right page number here. If you look at page, it's marked Roman numeral 3-19, the second paragraph, under the section Contra Diversion, you see, Mr. President, your Tower Commission reported back to you.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, Mr. Webb, I have a continuing objection to this continual use of the Tower Commission as a substitute for the actual hard facts that the government has them to produce in a case. I made the objection before, I renew it again. This is a commission that was created by this witness, ex post facto, if you will, after the events in question. The government, as I understand it, has the burden in this case to prove its case during its case. And bringing up all these facts from the Tower Commission is a substitute for that, and not an adequate substitute. It's hearsay, I don't know what it's based on. I don't know where the conclusions were. We know nothing about the witnesses that supported the information in the Tower Commission. And I believe it's being used here outside the scope of I'll stop right there.
Yesterday on direct...
That seems well taken.
Yesterday, Mr. Beckler, Your Honor, brought out on his direct examination, the President said on direct that as he sits here now, today, yesterday, he has never been able to have any belief that there ever was a diversion. And I'm simply trying to point out to him that that statement, respectfully, is not correct, that he has a significant amount of information that's been called to his attention. That's the only reason I'm bringing it out at this point, and then I'm dropping it.
Because the mere fact that the Tower Commission said so is not proof under oath that it occurred.
And I'm not suggesting that. I'm just trying to point out to the President that his statement here in this courtroom, that he appointed this Tower Commission, at least
whoever appointed it, I mean, I don't think it makes any difference. You keep telling him it's his Tower Commission, he appointed it. Let's cut all that out. If you want to ask him, did the Tower Commission say thus and so, and do you agree with that, you can do that.
Thank you, Judge. Do you see there the portion I called to your attention?
I have just seen it, and I have to tell you that to my recollection, this is the first time I have ever seen that.
And here's my question to you. Based on the testimony that you gave yesterday, that you, as the President, relied upon your national security advisor to keep you advised, I take it would be fair to say that it's your belief that Mr. Poindexter should have told you about the diversion if, in fact, it turns out that he knew about it. Is that a fair statement, Mr. President?
Well, if he knew about it. I didn't know about it, and it's very possible that he didn't. But as I say, this I can't explain.
I understand. I'm only asking.
This report, this is the first time I have ever seen a reference that actually specified there was a diversion.
And my question is, if he knew about it, you would have expected him to tell you about it. Is that correct?
Yes, unless maybe he thought he was protecting me from something. But no, I don't understand. This is very confusing to me about this. I have to say, if I might, on behalf of all of this and the many times that I've had to say I don't recollect, this whole thing has given an impression that the whole government of the presidential area of the government, the administration, only problem was this particular thing and this development and in this Iranian issue. And it ignores the fact that that was just one of many things that were going on, and that the government was involved in things of great import, not only having to do with domestic problems, but with the Cold War and things of that kind, and trying to arrive at treaties with regard to nuclear weapons and so forth. And I don't think it's fair to allow that impression to stand, that while I feel very strongly about the need for the Contras to be allowed to bring an end to this communist dynasty that is now in charge and took charge by force, while that is still important to me, and while the hostages and their fate has never left my mind, at the same time, this was not the all-consuming major problem that was confronting us at the time.
I understand. I take it also you'd say, would you not, Mr. President, no matter how important certain policy issues might have been, including the Contras and the hostages, that as President of the United States, you did not believe that your top officials in the administration should ever conceal from you material information concerning those policies. Is that a fair statement?
Objection, Your Honor. That gets into a legal conclusion.
Sustained.
Mr. President, let me go to one maybe last topic and I will sit down. You've talked several times about the events that broke in the Lebanese newspaper in early November of 1986. You recall that? And that did create kind of a firestorm of publicity in this country. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
In fact, it would be a fair statement that it probably was the greatest crisis during your presidency. Do you consider that a fair statement?
Well, it was when I went before the press and went before the people of the United States and told them the errors that were in that report and what actually had been the nature of the covert operation. And not one word of that seemed to ever get in the media, and they continued to say that Khomeini and I were working together and in trading arms for hostages and so forth, and those things, they continue to say that to this day.
And let me talk about that just for a moment as I hopefully finish up here. As far as that is concerned, that firestorm of publicity and whatever crises that created in your presidency, that still did not change your view that your top officials should still stay within the realm of the law in executing your policies. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. And I ask you that question because you are aware, are you not, Mr. President, that because of the publicity that occurred, Congress wanted to find out more facts about what had happened with the Iranian initiative. Is that correct?
Yes, but the first meeting that I had before I went before the public or the press at all was a meeting with the congressional leadership of both parties in a single meeting in the cabinet room at the White House.
And as I understand from that meeting and a number of other meetings, you told Congress and you told the public that you were absolutely committed to there being an absolute full disclosure to Congress of all information relating to the Iran initiative. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you felt very strongly about that because of the crises it had created, that it was imperative that all information be provided to the appropriate committees of Congress. Is that correct?
I can't remember in detail all of the things that I said should be done.
Let me help you on that because that's not fair. Do you recall giving a press conference on November 19th, 1986, right in the middle of this crisis?
Yes.
And I'll try to get an exhibit number here so I can call it to your attention. I think, Louise, can you find that in there? I think it's like
Should call down you
exhibit
first.
23, I believe.
What number?
23, I'm sorry, Your Honor.
That's 24. Oh.
You see where you gave a press conference on November 19th, 1986, Mr. President, regarding the Iran arms and Contra aid controversy?
Yes.
I'm going to direct your attention. You can read all of it. I just want to direct your attention to the statement I'm talking about, which is over on the second page there. Over on the second column, where the first full sentence says, I have further directed that all information relating to our initiative be provided to the appropriate members of Congress. And you go on to say, well, there may be some questions which for reasons of national security or to protect the safety of the hostages, I will be unable to answer publicly. But again, all information will be provided to the appropriate members of Congress. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And I take it that you were sincere when you made that statement. Is that correct,
Yes.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Now, am I correct that the two congressional committees under the congressional structure that are the appropriate committees here because there's intelligence information would be the House Intelligence Committee, called the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Is that correct to the best of your knowledge? That the intelligence committees are the appropriate members of Congress that you're referring to there?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and did you become aware that within a couple days after you had given that statement, that some members of your administration did go and testify to Congress or brief Congress? One being Bill Casey and another being Admiral Poindexter. Were you aware of that at the time in November of
We're
1980?
not going to go into that.
I just want to know if he's aware of it. And
We're not going to go into that.
then I won't. I only have
I
one.
don't want to create any casting out problems that don't exist.
Okay,
I'm cautioning you not to go into that.
Okay, just so you understand, that particular one, I would just say, I'll leave it alone. It's
I
not a
think you
casting
better.
guard. That comes later, but I will leave it alone. My only question to you is, Mr. Reagan, as far as any statements that may have been made by John Poindexter to House or Senate Intelligence Committees on or about November 21, 1986. Did you ever authorize or approve John Poindexter to make any false statements to Congress?
What is that question? What did I ever, what?
Let me ask it again. Sir, my question to you is, at any time in November of 1986, did you ever authorize or approve John Poindexter to make any false statements to any congressional committee concerning the Iran initiative?
Objection, Your Honor. We started out with this yesterday afternoon. It's been asked probably about 10 times since then, and this is just repetitive. This question has been asked and answered. I don't have yesterday's transcript, but at least 6 times yesterday.
I think that was about
probably shooting for about 4 or 5 today.
The President said no about a dozen times to a bunch of questions. I think one of them was this one.
Well, I was asking about the Contra side. This is the first time I've asked it about the Iran.
I believe yesterday there were questions about that same...
All right, ask the questions, get it over with.
No, I would not. Did not.
Thank you. Now, one of the... Do you recall any discussions with any members? I will strike the question. Is it also fair to say that at no time in November of 1986 did you ever authorize or approve anyone at the National Security Council to destroy or alter any records that relate to the Iran-Contra controversy?
I don't know, because of the very thing that I've just been reading here in my press conference about this whole thing, in which I pointed out that there were things that could not be made public because of the risk of death to a number of people, including both hostages and the people that we had been negotiating with. And that testimony, and I have no recollection if the press ever changed their mind about anything, but it was, I stated flatly that there were things that I could not allow to be said.
Publicly?
Yes.
And you make the point, you made the point very clear that they could not be said publicly, but they had to be revealed to Congress. Isn't that what you say right there, Mr. President?
Well, I have ordered in this coming week the proper committees will be briefed on this, and there are still some parts of this that we cannot go public with because it will bring to risk and danger the people that are held and the people that we've been negotiating with. We were not negotiating government to government. We were negotiating with certain individuals within that country.
The portion that you just read off a moment ago, Mr. President, on, Louise, if you'd show him on November 19th, the top of the page where you say, I have further directed that all information relating to our initiative be provided to the appropriate members of Congress. You go on to say there may be some questions which for reasons of national security or to protect the safety of the hostages, I will be unable to answer publicly. But again, all information will be provided to the appropriate members of Congress. Do you see that statement?
Yes.
And you agree with that statement, do you not? That all information should have been provided to Congress, as you stated there?
Yes, except that I cannot, without going into this, I cannot recall whether there were things that then came up that made us have to hold our revelations because of the safety of the other people involved. Well, now, I don't know whether that happened or not. I have no memory of whether that happened.
Well, that's, I mean, you don't recall, do you recall anything occurring that caused you to tell any member of your administration that information should be held back from Congress concerning information they provided regarding the Iran initiative?
Well, as I say, I do not recall that now because there were times and experience that told us that Congress was not, in many instances, capable of the kind of security that we required.
I understand. On November 19th, when you made this statement that all information should be made available to Congress,
yes.
Do you recall anything happening over the next 2 days that caused you to change your mind?
That's what I'm just saying. I cannot recall.
Okay, and even if you had decided that there was some information that would not be revealed to Congress, you would not instruct your administrative people in your administration to lie about it. You'd simply tell them to withhold the information. Is that correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement of what I would do.
Thank you. Now, in connection with the question I asked you a moment ago, which said you were looking at the press statement, did you at any time in November of 1986, Mr. President, at any time in November of 1986, did you ever authorize or approve anyone connected to the National Security Council to destroy or alter any records that related to the Iran and Contra affair?
Here again, I don't know, and I have to say, in connection with what I just said a short time ago, there could be things...
Your Honor, can I respect what you said?
No. Just let him answer the question.
There could be things that would arise in which, for the protection of those people, or which we were maintaining silence, there may have been things that we would have had to say at the time in connection with the preservation of those lives.
My question goes to, listen to my question, Mr. President. Did you ever authorize or approve any member of the National Security Council in November of 1986 to destroy or alter any records or documents relating to the Iran or Contra affair?
And this I cannot answer, I cannot recall, because it's the possibility that there were such papers that would violate the secrecy that was protecting those individuals' lives.
And did you, in your interrogatories, sir, state under oath that you definitely knew that you had never authorized anyone at the National Security Council to destroy or alter any records relating to the Iran arms transaction? I'll look at page interrogatory number 50, if you might show it to him, Louise. Do you see, Mr. President, where you said under oath in your interrogatory, at no time did I authorize or approve the destruction or alteration of documents relating to the Iran arms transactions or relating to the NFF by Colonel North or any other officer or employee of the United States or anyone else? Do you see that answer?
Yes.
Was that a truthful statement?
Yes, I have said that I have approved all of these as having been my answers.
Thank you.
And I did not learn of any such destruction or alteration prior to November 26, 1986.
Now that's what I want to get to. After November 26, 1986, did you learn that John Poindexter and or Oliver North became involved in destroying documents and records at the National Security Council relating to the Iran and Contra affair?
Objection, Your Honor. Being after November 26th, and I also think we're getting into some of this area that the Court alluded to before with regard to Castigar.
You want to come to the bench? I hate to set a precedent here at the last minute, so to speak, but I think I better find out what this is all about.
Mr. President, I just have a few more questions and I'll be finished. One of the great problems that you were having in November of 1986, as I believe you testified to yesterday, was that you publicly stated time and time again that the Iran initiative was not an arms for hostage transaction, but the press and the public simply were not accepting that. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement. I think in this instance, the press was so valuable about all of this that the people took their belief from what they were reading in the press, and I couldn't go to press every day.
Right, although you did, you did time and time again state that it was not arms for hostages because you believed that this was not an arms for hostage
I don't
transaction.
see the relevancy of that.
Well, let me
at
ask you this.
all. What the president said and what the press said,
Well-
it's nothing to do with this case.
Well, did John Poindexter in November of 1986 ever tell you about the existence of one particular document that on its face clearly established that this in fact was an arms for hostage transaction? Did he ever tell you about such a document in November of 1986?
I can't recall whether any such thing was told to me.
Let me try to refresh your memory. Look back at exhibit number 17 that I showed you earlier. Mr. President, the exhibit I've called your attention back to is this 1985 finding. Do you have that in front of you now?
Is this the page 17 that you're talking about?
Yes, exhibit 17.
Yes.
Do you see the document called the finding? Are you looking at that document? The top where it says finding pursuant to section?
Yes, yes.
I want to, if you read that finding, do you see where, when the description, if you go down to where the description of what the project is, it states, and I'll read it, as part of these efforts, certain foreign material and munitions may be provided to the government of Iran, which is taking steps to facilitate the release of the American hostages. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Okay. My question to you is, Mr. President, at least now as you read that presidential finding, do you now see that at least in that document, whoever drafted the document directly linked the Iranian initiative as arms for hostages? Do you at least see that's what it says there?
Yes.
Okay, now I want you to look at the next finding that you signed in January 17th, 1986, which is Exhibit 18. By the way, if you go back to Exhibit 17, do you also, we turn back to Exhibit, the 1985 finding. Do you also see where this finding says that we're going to be dealing with the government of Iran, where it says foreign material and munitions may be provided to the government of Iran? At least it says that.
Your Honor, may I object at this point on these findings?
Expand your outlook on the world. This April, C-SPAN explores the issues facing the European community in 1992, live from the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And we take you to Berlin for an in-depth look at the year's unfolding news. It's public affairs television that takes you beyond yesterday's headlines and tomorrow's lead story. C-SPAN, open to the public.
Next, we'll continue the videotape testimony of former President. Next, we'll continue the videotape testimony of former President Ronald Reagan. His remarks were recorded in Los Angeles February 16th and 17th and were played this week in U.S. District Court in Washington.
I realize we're trying to maybe shortcut a little time here, but the questions that are being asked are really not appropriate in view of what the actual documents say. Both documents include references to the release of hostages. There's a reference to the release of hostage in the document number 17. There's a reference to the release of hostages in document number 18. Yes, there's more information in 18, but one could properly say that 18 also indicates some linkage to hostages as well. And I believe that the foundation has not been laid for any of these questions in this form.
You made your point for the record, and I overrule the objection.
Could I add something here to
Well,
this?
can I ask the question first?
Go ahead. You may state what you wish to state,
Well,
Mr. President.
this talking of private citizens and so forth, working to get the freedom of hostages. Well, yes, the private people were the Iranians, and the arrangement that we had made that, yes, we would accede to their request to buy the TOW missiles if they would use their influence to try and free the hostages from the Hezbollah. And so, yes, there was no involvement of the government of Iran in this at all. And so it was private citizens, but not ours. It was theirs. And our reward to them for taking that action was to sell them the missile shipment that they'd asked for.
I understand, although all I'm saying is Exhibit 17, the finding on its face says you're going to be dealing with the government of Iran. That's what it says. On Exhibit 17. Sean, please, does he have Exhibit 17?
Well, yes, to the government, which is taking steps to facilitate the release.
I just want to show you the next one, Exhibit 18. If you look at 18, when the finding comes out in January, the one that you signed in January, do you see that in this finding it set forth first of all, do you see where it sets forth 3 different purposes for the Iranian initiative? Do you see where it lists 1, 2, and 3?
Yes.
If you read that, I think you could agree, Mr. President, that by the time this finding comes out, it's not as clear that this is an arms for hostage transaction. Is that a fair statement?
Objection, Your Honor. That's the point of my earlier objection. These documents speak for themselves. The words are what they say. You can draw different conclusions. Let Mr. Webb argue to the jury what he concludes these findings are. But to ask this witness what his conclusions are about these findings is clearly objectionable.
Your Honor, I think I'm asking the President, I'll just ask him to read off.
No, I asked what's the basis of your question?
The basis of my question is that I think since...
So how he understands the documents?
Yes, as the President of the United States, yes.
I sustain the objection.
Well, Mr. Reagan, let me ask, excuse me, President Reagan, let me ask you this question. Go back to Exhibit 17, the first finding, the one in 1985. The one that you just told me a moment ago does on its face show the arms for a hostage link. In November of 1986, looking at that document, in November of 1986, did you ever authorize or approve John Poindexter to tear up or destroy that particular finding?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach the bench?
Okay.
I think this may be my last question, Mr. President. In November of 1986, did you ever authorize or approve John Poindexter in November of 1986 destroying the 1985 finding that is reflected as tab 17?
As I've said before, I have no recollection of that.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no more questions.
All right, we'll find out now. I'll suit myself whether Mr. Beckler wishes to redirect now or not at all, or how long it's going to take, whether we should take a luncheon recess or whether we should go on and get it over with, depending on how long you expect to take. And I don't mean to hurry you in any way. But
yes, Your Honor. My inclination is probably if we could take a short let me confer here. My idea is maybe a short recess, and then we can continue our redirect, and it shouldn't take very long, rather than waiting all the
Mr.
way
Olson
through,
too, and see what.
Let me confer with
Could
Mr.
we please confer? And then
Go right ahead, do that. I'll wait here while you confer.
I think probably in light of these interrogatories answers and taking a look at them, I think we ought to have the luncheon recess, and then I'll continue my redirect after that, and I don't believe I'll start my redirect thereafter.
Start your redirect. What does that mean? Are we going on to?
No, I haven't yet started my redirect, commenced my redirect. That does not mean it will continue on for several hours. I don't mean to.
How long is it going to take?
Ballpark?
Ballpark.
An hour? If that.
All right, I promised everybody we'd be out of here long before lunch, so you're making a lie out of me, and I'll take
Well,
it
Your
out
Honor,
of you sometime.
that goes back to these interrogatories. But I'll try to be as brief as possible. But I think it would expedite things if I were able to look at these now rather than trying to formulate my questions right away.
45 minutes be enough for lunch?
I'm sorry?
45 minutes be enough for lunch? An hour?
The logistics, I'm not quite sure I know how we'll handle, because we understood that we would be finished prior to lunch. I don't know whether any arrangements have been made to bring anything in. It has been a long day and a long morning for the president, and needless to say, we're very disappointed that.
Well, I'm as disappointed as you are, but the alternative is to come back some other time, which we certainly don't want to do.
No, we don't.
And I'm going to be guided by what you and the president would like to do.
Well, I think we'd better take an hour then,
Okay.
simply because I think we'll need that time to make whatever arrangements.
We'll take an hour for lunch, and then I'll push Mr. Beckler to finish quickly.
Thank you.
That means that
Gentlemen. Mr. Beckler?
Good afternoon, Mr. President.
afternoon.
I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is there are going to be more questions. The good news is it shouldn't take too long.
I just heard the last part of that.
Mr. President, referring you to the book of interrogatory answers, I'm just going to ask you about a few of those. Let me get your copy up there. First, if you can, could you turn to your answer to question number 9. Let me get that. Does the court still have its book there, and clerk?
Well, this is number 9.
Yeah, this is 9. It's tab 9. I'm sorry, Mr. President. Tab 9. Now, looking at your answers under tab 9, and the question generally is, at any time between September 16th, 1983 and November 25th, 1986, did you authorize or approve any action with respect to the Contras by any of the following? And then it lists a number of people, Oliver North, John Poindexter, et cetera, a list of different people who were involved in this case. Could you just read to the jury your first part of your answer there, starting with, as I have stated, that paragraph right there?
Yes. As I've stated in these interrogatory answers, it was the consistent policy of my administration to advocate the support of the freedom fighters by the Congress, the American people, and our friends and allies abroad. Thus, administration officials were generally authorized to implement that policy.
All right, let's go on, Mr. President, to another tab. And this follows, this is tab number 32. So we just skipped about 22 questions right there.
All right.
Tab 32, it's a rather long question, and essentially, well, bear with me for a minute here. What I'd like you to do is the question generally refers to the Israeli tow shipments, the Iranian project, and so on and so forth. What I'd ask you to do, if you could, is just read to the jury, if you will, the answer that you gave to this in paragraph C, right over here at the bottom, starting with, I do not recall discussing.
Well, I do not recall discussing how exactly the arms would be transferred to Iran, because the transfer would not be overt. The use of an intermediary or an agent, formal or informal, of the CIA would have been appropriate. Similarly, the assistance of Israel in accomplishing the transfer would have been appropriate.
That's it. I believe it ends at that point, Mr. President. The next is another paragraph. Let's just move forward now to tab number 34. Now, 34, once again, is a question about these Iranian missile sales and shipments. Specifically, with regard to those sales, there's some sub-questions within the initial questions, and it says, did you authorize or approve the payment of any proceeds from any sale of U.S. arms to Iran to Secord Hakim, North, or any entity of which Secord Hakim or North was a principal?
Well, I first learned that Iran had paid an amount higher than that charged to the CIA when Attorney General Meese told me that he had learned on November 24th and 25th, 1986. I did not authorize such a cost differential. I was unaware of the existence of residual funds, and I was thus unaware of any purpose to which these excess residual funds might be put. I did not authorize their use for any purpose.
Now, if I will refer you, Mr. President, to your answers to E and F, let me show you. Sorry, and I tell you, it was my mistake. Did I tell you tab 34? Actually, it's beyond 35.
All right.
And I referred you to the section here about, did you authorize or approve the payment of any proceeds from the sale? And then your answers to that are contained in two places, actually. That's in E and F and I and J on the next page. Could you please read to the members of the jury
All right.
what your answers were under E, F right here?
When I authorized and approved the sale of arms to moderate elements in Iran, I implicitly authorized the acts that were necessary to accomplish these sales. Because I did not discuss the details of the transactions during that time, I do not recall ever authorizing any operational role by either Secord or Hakim in the Iranian initiative. I do not believe I ever was asked to authorize or approve this covert action in such detail.
Now finally, on this particular question, the answer you gave under I to J, which is starting with, as I stated above.
As I stated above, I do not recall ever being asked to authorize or approve such specific operational details, and I do not believe that I would have been asked to do so. At that time, I was unaware that profits or residual funds would be generated by the provision of arms to moderate elements in Iran.
And the I to J answer refers to the question, did you authorize or approve the payment of any proceeds from any sale of United States arms to Iran to Secord, Hakeem, North, or any entity. Is that correct?
I imagine so, yes. I would assume so.
And in terms of your answer to IEJ, such discussions with Admiral Poindexter about the proceeds of the money were considered by you to be operational details, were they not?
Yes.
We just have really one or two more questions on this telephone book size of interrogatory answers. If you would now, Mr. President, turn to number 48. And let me show you. Number 48, the question refers to the topic you've discussed on cross-examination as well as on direct about the November 3rd publication in Ashura about the shipment. Could you read your answer starting with in the national security briefings? That's on the middle of the page. Read that to the jury, please.
In the national security briefings of, that's NSB, of November 6 and 7, 1986, my advisors and I discussed U.S. relations with Iran and its internal situation in light of the Jacobson release, the Lebanese newspaper article, and Speaker Rafsanjani's speech. And based on the information provided me, I decided that it was best for the administration to maintain a no-comment posture.
And continue on to that next paragraph, Mr. President.
All right.
It's right down here.
Yes. On November 6, 1986, in response to a question on dealings with Iran raised by a member of the press at a signing ceremony, I offered no comment, but appealed to the press not to speculate on the Middle East story, because I felt that any statement confirming the story could result in the death of the hostages. I said the story had no foundation.
And then continue over to the next page.
All right. At the November 7, 1986 NSB, I also made the decision to brief the Intelligence Committee fully, but to hold no press briefing as long as the lives of the hostages were still at risk. When the issue was raised again on November 7th, I reiterated that we would not answer any questions without endangering, I could not answer any questions without endangering the people we were trying to rescue. On November 10th, 1986, I convened a special meeting of the NSC principals to discuss the publicity surrounding the Iran initiative and to discuss a proposed public statement on the matter. I approved the immediate release of the press statement, which both announced the meeting and made the point that during the meeting, I asked my advisors to ensure that their departments refrain from making comments or speculating about the hostage situation or allegation made in the Lebanese newspaper and by Speaker Rafsanjani.
Now, Mr. President, during that time frame of November 1986, it was a very touchy situation, was it not, with regard to what could be said and what could not be said?
Yes.
And there were different levels of disclosure that were appropriate depending on the time of the month or the day of the week as that month progressed. Is that not true?
Now, wait a minute. Repeat that, please.
Earlier in the month, there was a reluctance to make certain disclosures, and then as the month progressed, it became manifest that more and more disclosures have to be made, correct?
Well, yes.
And also there were different levels of disclosure that were appropriate depending on whom the audience was. There would be one level of disclosure for the Congress, is that correct? One level of disclosure for the public, in terms of the amount of information that could be given.
Well, I don't recall it that definitely as to drawing the distinction between the audiences to any disclosure, but I'm prepared to say that this sounds logical, even though I don't definitely recall.
But certainly the bottom line is, with regard to November, is, as you said in your interrogatory answers, you were still worried about lies and you had to be concerned about what disclosures were made, correct?
Yes.
Mr. President, you mentioned on cross-examination by Mr. Webb that you alluded to the fact that 1986 there were many things on your platter besides the Iran or the Contra situation. Do you recall giving him an answer to that effect? That there were maybe the...
Yes, I thought I did try to explain that this was just only one matter facing the administration, and the days from morning till night were very full of a number of most important situations.
In fact, you and Admiral Poindexter worked on a number of projects, did you not, during that year that had nothing at all to do with the Iran situation or the Contra situation? Right. You were working on arms control, is that correct?
Yes.
You were working on that was the same year that you had the transition in the Philippines from the Marcos regime to the Aquino regime, is that correct?
Yes.
It was the same year that in Haiti, Papa Doc Duvalier left office, or Duvalier Jr., is that correct?
I believe so.
It was also the same year that Admiral Poindexter was involved in the raid, in the successful raid on Libya, is that correct?
Yes, I think that was about the time that we made that, or conducted that operation.
And you recall that Admiral Poindexter was heavily involved at that time in that operation?
Yes.
It was also a year that you and the Admiral traveled to Tokyo for a summit in Tokyo, is that correct?
Yes.
There aren't too many more, but there were lots of other things going on that year. The release of Soviet dissidents, the exchanges there, the exchanges of Soviet and U.S. spies. You recall those events happening in 1986?
Well, yes, but not to the extent of being able to recall all the details.
In other words, with that kind of a schedule and those important events taking place, Mr. President, it's very conceivable that Admiral Poindexter would not fill you in on every little detail of every event that was going on. Is that correct?
I object to that question, Your Honor. As to what's in Admiral Poindexter's mind, it's calling upon him to speculate what is in Poindexter's mind, Your Honor.
I overrule the objection.
You may answer, Mr. President.
Yes, I had full confidence and number of those things going on. I placed my confidence in those people that were right at hand in conducting the affairs.
And the question basically was, and I'm sure maybe you might have just forgotten the exact question, basically the question was, with all of those things that were going on, Mr. President, you can understand how Admiral Poindexter would not give you the details of every part of every little detail of those various operations, including Iran-Contra. Could you not?
Yes.
Yeah. We're coming down the home stretch now. I just want to show you one more book, but it's only one small reference in the book. I don't want to intimidate anybody. This is number 15 in the government's exhibit book. This is just one point, Mr. President. Government 15 in their cross-examination to you is this incoming letter from Dante Fussell to the President on June 25th. It has a little R squiggled up in the top there. Is that by any chance your initial? Do you know?
I'm not sure, and it isn't exactly the way I usually do an initial.
All right, I just wanted to check on that. This is another one of those lawyers' things that we have to check on. Okay?
Right.
Mr. President, you recall on cross-examination being asked some questions about Mr. Hasenfus and the plane that went down in October of 1986?
Yes.
If Mr. Hasenfus were employed by the private benefactors, you would not consider him then connected to the U.S. government, would you?
No.
Mr. President, you understand, don't you, that Admiral Poindexter, as he sits here, is not claiming that you authorized him to commit any illegal acts. Do you understand that?
I object to I object to the form of that question.
I sustain the objection.
Mr. President, isn't it a fact that the acts that you authorized Admiral Poindexter to perform or engage in were within the law as you understood it to be?
Yes, because I think we're going back to the request to meet with some Iranian citizens for the purpose of discussing how the relations between our two countries could be improved.
And is it also a fact that the acts that you authorized Admiral Poindexter to perform with regard to the Contra situation, and which he in fact did engage in, is it your understanding or your belief that they were within the law?
Your Honor, I object to that unless you pinpoint acts or what specific acts.
Just one or two more questions.
All right. Nobody's hurrying you.
Mr. President, some of the acts that were discussed here by Mr. Webb on his cross-examination and some of the things I talked about on my direct examination, it's your position, is it not, that you believe that the acts that you were, those specific acts that you discussed, that you believe that you were asking Admiral Poindexter to conduct those acts within the law. Is that correct?
I object to that question unless you pinpoint acts. Some of the things he said he would not authorize if they were illegal. I object to the form of the
I
question.
think that's the same objection and equally as well taken as the last question. I don't know that Admiral Poindexter may have conducted many acts at that time, and some may have been okay and some not, and at least it's claimed that some were not, and to just throw them all in one melange is not good enough.
Well, Your Honor, as you recall, the prosecution was allowed to ask a lot of general questions about what the President was authorized to do, or what he authorized to be done and not to be done, and that's really what I'm doing as well. I don't see any distinction.
That's not what you're doing. What I allowed them to ask, I had good reasons for allowing them to ask those, and so far as these questions are concerned, I will not allow them.
Mr. President, you recall that Mr. Webb asked you questions about your press conference that you had on November 19th of 1986. I'm going to read to you if you recall making this statement at your press conference. This was with regard to the Iranian initiative. You said, talking about the views of your advisors, you said, "I weighed their views. I considered the risks of failure and the rewards of success, and I decided to proceed. And the responsibility for the decision and the operation," referring to the Iranian operation, "is mine and mine alone. As Mr. Lincoln said of another presidential decision, if it turns out right, the criticism will not matter. If it turns out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right will make no difference." Do you recall making that statement, Mr. President?
I'm going to object to the grounds of relevancy based on the issues in this case. The fact that he authorized the start of the Iranian initiative and alludes to Lincoln, I object to the grounds of relevancy.
Overruled. You make
Pin me down as to exactly when and where I use some of these quotes, which I do frequently. I have to tell you that I would not be able to swear as to what the occasion or what the date was, but I have to admit that, yes, I have used that quotation.
It sounds like what you would say, Mr. President.
thinking that myself.
And I could show you, Mr. President, we have an authorized transcript of the press conference that was held on November 19th. It's number 23 in the book that the independent counsel provided to you. This, as you can see, is an official record of your press conference news statements. It indicates November 19th, 1986. And I refer you to the...
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was referring him to the quote that I just read.
Where is it?
I'm sorry, it's on the bottom. Sorry, Your Honor. It's on the second page. It's at the bottom of the first full paragraph on the first column of the second page. Has Mr. Lincoln said of another presidential decision? You see it now, Mr. President?
What?
You see that quote now?
Oh, yes. President Lincoln was quite quotable.
And does that fairly, as you look at that today, your earlier speech, does that fairly reflect the state of your mind at the time that you made that speech back in November 19th, 1986?
It's getting to be a little
Here's the
bit
last question on-
far off into wild blue yonder, Mr. Becker.
There's the last question on this, Your Honor.
Okay.
Yes, and even sitting here, I'm tempted toward another quote of his, in which he said he could not perform the duties of his office for 15 minutes if he could not call upon one who was stronger and wiser than all others.
All right, thank you, Mr. President. I have no further questions of this witness.
Mr. Webb, do you feel that you urgently must recross?
Very short, President. That's all, Judge.
Another ping pong game, so I'm not urging you to ask more questions, but I'll give you the opportunity.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. President, just on one of the points that Mr. Beckler made, I just have a couple of questions to make sure that I'm not confused on it. Mr. Beckler asked you a question about these residual proceeds or residual funds from the Iranian initiative, and I believe you referred to them as operational details. And I guess my question is that you agree, do you not, that the diversion of Iranian arms sale money to the Contras, you never considered that an operational detail that John Poindexter should not have told you about, did you?
Well, and as I have said a number of times sitting here, I was not aware that there was a diversion.
Well, I know. In fact, this morning when I showed you the Tower Commission report to you where they talked about Poindexter and North both admitting the diversion, I think you told me this. Is this the first time in this courtroom that you came to realize, in fact, that a diversion had actually occurred?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Now, let me ask you, do I understand that as far as the diversion was concerned, if you had been asked about it by John Poindexter, if you had been asked about it to approve it, you would not have approved it and you would have disapproved it. Is that a true statement?
Well, the only thing I can say is to that, again, and unable to recall the details of what was going on then, but I do recall that in answer to a similar query from the press on that note, I said that had I been aware that there was that added money, I would have insisted on giving it back.
Okay. And also in your interrogatories under oath, the interrogatories you gave under oath to the Office of Independent Counsel, did you state emphatically that had you been asked about the diversion, you would not have approved it, you would have disapproved it if John Poindexter asked you to approve it? Did you state that under oath, sir?
Whether I did or not.
Interrogatory number 40. I'm sorry, I was looking for the book. I apologize.
Oh.
Did you say that under oath, Mr. President, in the interrogatories to the best of your knowledge?
Now, I can't recall whether that or where I said it, but I did have a feeling that that the raising of the price was, as far as I was concerned, was untenable and should never have been done.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. President. If you can look at interrogatory number 39, which is asking about the residual proceeds, I'm just going to direct your attention to a statement where it says, I did not authorize such a use for the proceeds, talking about diversion,
Mm-hmm.
and nor do I recall being asked to do so.
That's right.
If I had been asked to approve or authorize such a use, I would not have done so. Do you see that statement?
Mm-hmm.
Was that a truthful statement?
Yes, because as I said before, when it was asked by someone else, I said that had I been aware of it, I would have given the money back.
And so you would never have authorized John Poindexter to engage in the diversion if he asked you about it, would you?
Your Honor, this is about the 10th time this has been asked.
I have no more questions, Your Honor.
All right. Well, we're going to terminate this proceeding now. The only thing before I do that, I would like to see the lawyers, not all of them necessarily, but at least somebody from each group to come into chambers for just a minute. We're going to take something up on the record, but without the videotaping going on. As far as everybody else is concerned, I thank everybody for coming down here and wasting part of your weekend, and particularly you, Mr. President. I'm appreciative that you came, and I'm sorry that we had to keep you longer than we anticipated. I'm, in a way, glad that you're no longer the commander-in-chief, because I promised us that we would be finished early this morning, and I wasn't able to keep that promise, and I don't know what commanders-in-chief do with people like that.
As Commander-in-Chief found there were a few promises he couldn't keep either when he got in office.
Thank you, Mr. President.
But I thank you for making it possible for us to do this way, and I appreciate it very much.
We're now finished. Thank you. If you'll come to chambers and the court report.